In this video, we're going to talk about some board governance policies. I am not going to provide you with the details of each and every policy, of course, but I am going to highlight for you some policies as a governance board that you want to consider, and in some cases, be sure that you have. So when you talk about, in the last video, we talked about kind of 4 areas, and you'll see here that I'm going to expand upon those 4 areas a little bit. When you talk about board governance policies, how does your board run? Over and above just what is in your bylaws. Your bylaws will talk about meetings, it'll talk about the number of board of directors, it'll talk about how directors are elected. But in addition to that, do you have a conflict of interest policy? Does your board and do the members of your board know that they have to disclose conflicts of interest and perhaps recuse themselves if there's an issue that comes before the board that they may have a conflict with? Do they know what that conflict of interest policy, or what their conflict of interests are, how they recognize it? So you want to have a conflict of interest policy. In addition, how are you managing your funds as a board? You want to have fund management policies, and I think DPI will make very clear that you do have those in place, because I'm suspecting there are very specific requirements that come along with certainly the federal grant funds. So what are those policies that are in place? Also consider the authority, and I talked about this in the last video. What's the authority of your board? Does your board have the authority to act only when the board acts? Is there a spokesperson for the board? What's the individual authority of each member? What's the obligation of board members to be involved in the community, or responding to constituents, or responding to parents? Thinking about how does your board run, and do you have policies that tell you how the board is going to run? So that's one area. The second area is student-related policies. Really, a lot of these that are set forth on here are basic ones that you have to have just to know how you run the school. How do you admit students? Who's going to be admitted? What's the policy? You have too many students, then you have spaces. What are the lottery procedures going to be? What's your attendance policy and your truancy policy? What are your promotion policies in terms of promoting a student from elementary school to middle school? What are the criteria for granting a high school diploma? The academic performance, the completion of a civics test, the recommendation of teachers. What are your academic standards? What are academic standards with regard to math and science and all of those core courses? And the promoting, as we talked about, from 5K, if you run a 5K to first grade. Other student-related policies, non-discrimination policies, bullying and harassment policies, retaliation. Title IX, which is the policy that prohibits discrimination based on sex. Special education policies. Policies with respect to discipline or locker searches, or searching a backpack. If you have reasonable suspicion to believe a student has a weapon in their backpack, do you have a policy that tells you when you can do that and lets students know that you have the right to search their backpack? A seclusion and restraint policy. Do you have a policy that spells out, we will train our the covered persons in our school, we'll train them, and here's what we will allow for purposes of seclusion and physical restraint. So a policy that deals with that. Privacy in locker rooms, video monitoring, an acceptable use policy. Do students and employees know, but here we're talking about students, I guess, do they know that when they are on a computer in your school and using your server, they don't have any right to privacy, that you have the ability to go on and do searches with respect to what they may be searching on the internet, what they may be drafting, all of those sorts of things. Acceptable use policy as far as electronics. I wish all districts would have a policy, a stricter policy with respect to the use of cell phones, but looking in terms of what your policies are with respect to that. Prescription and non-prescription drugs. You have a policy that says, here's, as a parent, what you will need to provide to us before our nurse will issue prescription medication or non-prescription medication. Transportation policies, a facility use policy. You have a school that you get a request from somebody in the community to hold a community meeting at your school? Do you have a facility use policy that dictates how you will consider that request, what requirements there are, and what steps have to be followed to do that? Also, policies with respect to English language learners, curriculum policies, a parent who disagrees with the curriculum that you're teaching. Do you have a policy that gives the parent the right to lodge that disagreement? The threat assessments and the safety plans, now in particular with the new laws in Wisconsin that apply to safety threats. Do you have policies and procedures with respect to that? Special education, when you talk about 2X and 2R charter schools, do you have policies that deal with referral of a student, evaluation of a student? Are they evaluated under IDEA for special ed? Are they evaluated for accommodations under Section 504? Who's a member of the IEP team? Who's a member of the 504 team? When you talk about 2X and 2R charter schools, that your school is responsible for all of those issues. Personnel policies. If you are going to be the employer of personnel and the staff in your school, do you have an equal opportunity employment policy? Do you have a harassment policy? What if the staff member has been found to be using alcohol or drugs while they are at school? Do you have a policy that deals with that? How about evaluations or grievances, whistleblower protections, so that a teacher knows that if they come forward and report that another teacher is violating federal law in some way, that they won't be retaliated against? The school community relation policies. When you talk about public record policies, what's your policy say? Who's your record custodian? Do you maintain records at your school? And if you do, who does a records request go to? What are your open meeting policies? What's your visitor policy, facility use policy? What about if somebody from the public gives you a gift of money and says, I want it to be used for X? What's your policy with regard to that? In addition to your board policies, your policies and procedures, and when we talk about, remember, procedures, they may be things that are more administrative procedures and guidelines that are issued by the administration. Are you setting those out also in your student handbooks, your employee handbooks, and are you ensuring that they have consistency across the board in policies, handbooks, and contracts? In the next video, we're going to be talking about how the policies and procedures fit within those additional documents.